thank you all for joining this roundtable on a session related to Europe and the war in Ukraine. My name is Emmanuel Navon. I'm the executive director of the Israel office of ELNET and an adjunct professor at Tel Aviv University in International Relations, formerly at IDC, but no longer, because I have to invest my time in ELNET. So we're very glad for you all to be here. We have a very distinguished panel, as well as many friends of ELNET here in this room. We're going to be talking, of course, about the war in Ukraine 2 years later, and its global impact, of course, also in the context of the current war in the Middle East. I would say, as an introduction, that when the war in Ukraine erupted, when the Russian invasion began I believe in February 2022, it was really a shock in Europe, which was, I think, very well expressed by the German Chancellor Scholz when he spoke about the Zeitenwende, a historic change in the perception that the Europeans have of war and peace and the dangers to their borders, something which unfortunately we in Israel have been experiencing since the first day of our independence. And I think that this, of course, de facto creates some common threats and strategic interest among us, because, as we know, Russia is also strengthening its ties with Iran and building a global coalition together with China, Iran, of course, and now also North Korea, of autocratic regime that try to undermine the rule-based order that was established painfully after World War II and expanded with the end of the Cold War. So we'll be talking about this today. Let me introduce our distinguished panel. We have on my left Her Excellency Ambassador Nina Nordström, who is the ambassador of the Republic of Finland in Israel. I have on my right Antonia Dimou, who is the director of the Middle East Studies at the Greek Institute for Security and Defense Analysis. On her right, Shashank Joshi, who is the defense editor of The Economist, and on the left of Her Excellency, Dr. Arvid, who is the CEO of Negotiation Task Force, or NTF, and a lecturer on government at Harvard University. So thank you all for being here. Maybe I will start with you, Madam Ambassador, because your country has a long experience of resisting Russian aggression, and I think you're one of the rare countries that managed to do this at the beginning of the Second World War, and that definitely shows that there is a precedent of a small country able to resist this Russian expansionism. And the question that I would ask in this context is, how do you see, now that Finland has joined NATO, of course, as you know, Vladimir Putin was granted the best salesman of NATO prize in 2024 for bringing Finland and also Sweden. But the question is now, how do you see the strategy as Finland as a new member of NATO, and the resolve of Europe vis-à-vis Russia, now that we see this new axis and this strengthening of the relation between Russia and North Korea? Maybe can you give us some more insight on the strategy of Finland and the rest of Europe facing this threat?
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you, ELNET, for convening us around the issue of Ukraine. Today is really an interesting day in Europe and in the EU in Ukraine as well, I suppose, in the sense that the EU and Ukraine start so-called association negotiations, membership negotiations today. It's a big thing for Europe, certainly, and I believe it places also Ukraine in a much better position than before. It's some kind of testament to Ukraine's own resolve to be part of the democratic family of countries that the EU is, and certainly it tells us something about their ambition. There's a road ahead. There are criteria to be met, but I think it's going to be a big asset for the future of Europe, that such a big and important country is interested in joining, because it tells us that they share our values around democracy and the rule of law, and of course peace. All the values that we don't see Russia sort of gathering around. Also, the EU is very united around this. We often hear how the EU is divided. It can't come up with common stances, but it certainly can on Ukraine, and has done so for the last 2+ years. So who would have thought on the 24th of February 2022 that we are now 2 years later seeing Ukraine negotiating for EU membership? And who would have thought at that time also that, as you just mentioned, Emmanuel, we would have had already now Finland as a member of NATO for over a year, and Sweden for a few months. It is certainly a big change for us, and it improves Finland's security. We have joined out of self-interest, but we are also contributors to peace, security, stability in Europe. With our strong national defense that we have brought with us, we are givers as well as receivers. So all in all, indeed, Ukraine remains an exceptionally important issue in Europe. There is war in Europe, and we need all to continue supporting Ukraine in what they need. They have laid out their own, they've presented their peace formula. It's for us to continue supporting them in any way we can, and we will do so. And I guess the most important thing for me to say is that it's not too late for anyone or any country to support Ukraine, be it politically clearly in unequivocal terms, politically, or be it materially in any way possible and according to Ukrainian needs. So support to Ukraine is support to our common and shared values.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. And I mentioned to you before that I'm planning on visiting Finland with my wife this summer, and the way Finland presents itself is the happiest country in the world. So you brought happiness to NATO, hopefully also, added strength for the sake of Ukraine. But thank you very much. I would like to ask you now, Antonia, you come from Greece, and as you know, in recent years there has been an increased partnership between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, including in the field of energy and natural gas. We kind of have now this regional organization of natural gas, which includes, by the way, also Egypt, and which is also obviously very relevant in the context of the war in Ukraine, because one of the mistakes that was made in Europe, including in Germany, was to over-rely on Russian natural gas. And of course, the Russian aggression in Ukraine made it necessary in Germany to reevaluate, and in Europe in general, this this natural gas dependency on Russia. And here, of course, this kind of de facto consortium between in the East Med, which include our countries, of course, cannot in by itself replace the resources, the natural resources of Russia, but we do constitute an important alternative, I think. So my question to you is, in the context of the war in Ukraine, after over 2 years, how do you see this regional energy partnership in the East Med being relevant to the Europe, to Germany and other countries in Europe to resist the Russian aggression and help them basically win themselves from Russian gas.
True. Over the last almost a decade, I would say, there has been a very important regional energy cooperation in this Mediterranean. As you accurately highlighted, this Mediterranean Gas Forum is a regional forum which connects the governments national, regional, intergovernmental organization that serves as a clearinghouse as well in order to bring together the energy suppliers, the customers, the energy industry, and the countries together. Well, the war on Ukraine has triggered a European coordinated action and policies when it comes to reinforcing Europe's energy security by reducing its reliance on Russian energy. And in that regard, this Mediterranean can play a very incremental and very important role. It is in this context, for example, that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, under her previous tenure, she visited Egypt, and an LOI was signed between the European Union, Egypt and Israel to facilitate the export of gas from the region to Europe. So this is a very, very important element that we have also to take into account. But Greece has been one of the prime countries in the region that has served as an alternative entrance for gas reserves to Europe. And I will be very specific and crystal clear in that regard, in that context. So Greece, since the start of the war on Ukraine, has received increased LNG shipments at Revithousa, onshore terminal located in southwest of Athens, which has been, in fact, updated twice in order to maintain increased LNG gasification capacity and to receive bigger LNG volumes. That gas has been funneled to the Balkans and southeast of Europe. At the same time, the Greek port of Alexandroupolis, during the war on Ukraine, except for the military operational facilities that have been provided in order to sustain the war on Ukraine and part of the NATO and American aid to enter Europe and therefore in the end reach Ukraine, it has been very instrumental for the transfer of LNGs to the Balkans and Southeast Europe. In fact, the swift construction of the offloading floating storage and gasification unit in the port of Alexandroupolis has facilitated that transfer. In fact, the Alexandroupolis FSRU facilitates the offloading and the transfer of 5.5 billion cubic meters of gas annually to the Balkans. And also let's bear in mind that increased LNG, American LNG shipments to Revithousa managed to sustain the energy market of Bulgaria when in April 2022 Gazprom took the decision to deprive the Balkan state by 90% of its need. So Greece has been a key player in that regard, and a lot of infrastructure projects, especially the Alexandroupolis project, FSRU, is a piece of infrastructure that is tied to other interconnection projects, like the Greece-Bulgaria interconnector and the gas links between Bulgaria, North Macedonia, and Serbia, proving what regional energy cooperation means and rendering Greece a regional energy hub. And I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll come back to this issue because I have other questions regarding the future, of course, of this export of natural gas. But thank you very much for this. I'd like to ask now. I'd like to ask you, Shashank. And I must say, as a disclaimer, that I've been reading The Economist religiously since high school, so I have a soft spot for your newspaper. But I wonder, when you joined The Economist, if you thought at the time that the world would keep you so busy, because you are defense editor. And I guess 20 years ago, being defense editor, there was not as much to write about than today. And my question is to you. I mean, now of course the UK is no longer part of the EU, but is an important part of the architecture of NATO's defense in Europe. There's been a lot of talk about building up Europe defense to face Russia, especially with the prospect of a second Trump presidency, which with everything that it would imply in terms of possible, American withdrawal from European defense. How do you see Europe's resolve today, really, to face Russia in case of a U.S. disengagement from European security? We know that the Poles are really spending a lot of money on their defense, apparently 4% of GDP this year. But of course, the countries that have a common border with Russia, it kind of concentrates your mind when you have them as your neighbor. But what about the rest of Europe? How do you see this resolve in Europe, really, to face Russia by themselves, if need be?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for reading us. I did earlier see Ephraim Halevi outside, who told me he's been a subscriber for 70 years.
It's more than me.
I don't know if
it's
you
more
can
than
beat
me.
that. Okay, all right. If anyone can beat 70, let me know. There's a special prize waiting for you. And when I joined, yes, the world was a bit less chaotic. I remember 2021 watching the fall of Kabul and thinking, this was very tiring. I'm sure next year will be calm. Before I thought Putin would ruin my Christmas. And of course, he didn't ruin my Christmas, but he did ruin the subsequent 2 years for all of us. So a few points on the UK, first of all. We are, of course, this government, which will be history in a few days or a week, pledged to spend 2.5% of GDP on defense by the end of the decade, which is quite a long timeline. The opposition, which will soon be the government, hasn't made the same pledge, but they will find themselves probably bound to a similar timeline if they're going to meet all their commitments. And I think it's worth saying that the UK, on the one hand, has been firmly part of the NATO consensus that has developed in the last 2 years. We've had a battle group in Estonia, of course, for a very long time. We've committed, like other battle groups in Eastern Europe, to practice scaling this up to brigade level. I know brigade level might seem nothing to you here in Israel, where you are able to field and deploy multiple combat-capable brigades more easily. But in the European context, believe me, this is impressive and an achievement for us. And so we've also been practicing that, and we've also seen other major changes. Germany's government, for example, pledged to deploy an entire brigade in Lithuania, which is extremely significant by our standards, and would not have been conceivable, I think, about 2 years ago. On the other hand, the UK is not immune to the same dynamics we see in other parts of Europe around hedging. We are all hedging and have been for a while. It's not that we see clear alternatives to NATO, and I'll come on to that in a second, but there are different regional geometries developing everywhere you look. A few years ago, we saw a substantial agreement between France and Greece, a bilateral deal. We have also seen, in the UK context, huge emphasis placed on the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, a coalition of about 10 Northern European countries focused on the Baltic region, involving many countries in Northern Europe. And these are not seen as alternatives to NATO, which is still seen as indispensable, even despite the political uncertainty, but they are seen as complementary, particularly complementary in circumstances where Article 5, NATO's mutual defense clause, has not clearly been breached, and you may need alternative coalitions to form that can step up to the plate in hybrid situations, in sub-threshold situations, as we increasingly call them, where there may not be consensus inside the North Atlantic Council, which is now 32 members, some of whom, I don't think there are any Hungarians in this room, I can say this, may not be on the same page in a crisis involving Russia. And so you are looking at other forums which may need to act first, and the UK has been very, very involved in that. But there is a recognition, I think, that on the one hand, there is the need to build up our autonomous capabilities to consider the day when the US is retrenching from Europe. But there is also a dilemma, and I'll just say this before I end, which is that on the one hand, we tell ourselves a story in Europe that we can all, if we all build up our defense capabilities, it's win-win. We build up our own autonomous defense capacity, and we hedge against American withdrawal, and we show the Americans we are burden sharing. In reality, the problem I think we face is that our deficiencies are concentrated in some particular sectors, in capability gaps where we desperately need the United States. And I would point here particularly to air defense, to logistics, to command and control. Command and control is a particularly serious problem, in which, if you look at the command and control in NATO, in shape, in our headquarters in NATO, only a small number of countries, led by US, France, America, although Finland brings very substantial capability in this regard, of planning operations, senior staff appointments. We lack these. So you have a choice. Do we make our defense investments in frontline capability gaps, ammunition, armored maneuver units, these things, or do we fill in very expensive, not very sexy gaps that the public don't really understand, like command and control, like air defense, AWACS, all kinds of other things, which are much more difficult. But if the Americans were to leave, those are the things we would be desperate to have, and without which we would be unable to mount a serious defense of Europe. So we are still grappling with these dilemmas, and they will potentially worsen as we approach the elections this year.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I would like to ask now Arvid about, since you're an expert in negotiations, this is what you do, right? How do you see in the present context, the potential for negotiations on the issue of Ukraine? Because again, we just spoke about the potential of a second Trump presidency, which of course would completely change the prospects of Ukraine and its strategy, and which might, basically bring us to the stage of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. For lack of choice, if that is the decision coming from Washington. How do you see in the present stage the potential for such negotiations, given the forces on the ground?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so first of all, to maybe clear up a common misperception. So it's very interesting that negotiation has maybe more recently become a very politicized term, right? People associate all kinds of things with it. Like in the Middle East, is it negotiations with, like Hamas? What are you talking about? And in the context of the Ukraine war, it's often immediately understood as, are you making a concession to Putin, right? So most people who work in the field would simply look, first of all, at negotiations in a very pragmatic way, and simply say, analytically, negotiation analysis simply tells us something about the interests of different parties, okay? And we can just use that to assess, answering your question, what is the current likelihood of an agreement, okay? Just pragmatically. Is it very likely, very unlikely? And then you can ask more prescriptively, okay, what would need to change in order to make negotiations more likely? It's just, from that perspective, it's just a tool. You can use negotiations. And so, to answer your question, I think at the current moment, negotiations are very unlikely to yield any result in terms of a ceasefire or let alone a peace agreement, which from an analytical perspective is probably due to what the negotiation people in this room will know, what we call the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? The BATNA, or what dictates the willingness of parties to negotiate. If they think whatever they can get without negotiations is actually better than what they can get out of the deal, they wouldn't negotiate. And that brings me to three dilemmas I briefly want to outline from a negotiation perspective. If we are looking at, to simplify it a little bit, at the collective West, so broadly defined, the pro-Ukrainian coalition, I think there are at least three dilemma in which sort of the strategy is stuck. And in a strange way, these three dilemma make a protracted conflict, so the current situation, the de facto BATNA of the West, even though we're not saying it. Okay, so what I'm saying here is no Western leader would say it, but all the other options that are being perceived by Western leaders are more uncomfortable than the status quo, right? So let me go over these dilemma, and then I tell you.
Sounds like the Middle East.
It sounds, yes, there are some similarities. So very briefly, because we want to have a debate. So the three mistakes, I think, are built into the current Western approach, right? Are, first of all, what you could call the punishment dilemma. From the beginning on, it was like this contradiction between we must hold Putin accountable, he cannot get away with land grab. If we do that, other dictators will follow or whatever, and we must punish him. But it was also always clear, no direct war with Russia, for good reasons. And that's already a contradiction, right? Because you basically limit the scale of punishment you're willing to inflict on the other side. So you can find that good or bad, but just a dilemma. The second dilemma is the nuclear dilemma. It's a very popular threat in Russian strategic circles to say, okay, we cannot give in to nuclear blackmail, right? So nuclear coercion, it's not allowed to work on us. We will not allow Putin to sort of coerce us and to intimidate us. However, it is a reality that whatever negotiation you envision with the Russians in whatever format, the Ukrainians and the Russians, the West, Russia and NATO, Putin will have these nukes, and there is no negotiation that will work without Russian nuclear risk manipulation. It's a reality. There is no negotiation with the Russians in which the nukes won't be used for that, okay? So you can say now, this is so terrible that we don't even negotiate, or you can say, well, maybe we have to figure out how do you negotiate even though Putin is going to try to do that, okay? And the last dilemma from a negotiation perspective is what you could call the coalition dilemma. So when you build a coalition of actors or parties and rally them to your cause in negotiations, negotiation one-on-one would dictate you have a choice between two different things, okay? So you can either have a broad coalition with a very narrow mandate or a narrow coalition with a broad mandate, but you can never have both, right? And so I think what the West has been trying is they've been trying to build this very broad international pro-Ukraine coalition, but the mandate is getting increasingly broad, or there's like mission creep. So a narrow mandate, for example, would be something like, we want to get as many countries together as possible, and we only have a goal such as a ceasefire, okay? Such as ending the war as soon as possible. Or it could be something different, such as we focus primarily on preventing nuclear use, okay? This would be very narrow. But instead, I mean, we can now do a laundry list of all the things that are sort of now attached to the Ukraine war. For example, it starts with, this is actually part of a global battle between democracies and autocracies, right? Or you can say there's a direct link between Ukraine and Taiwan, right? So you have some strategists who say there's like a geostrategic goal of inflicting a like broader strategic defeat on Russia. Now, whatever you think about these things, and if we individually think they are good goals or bad goals, the more you add all of this stuff to what you're trying to do in Ukraine, the more do you maybe boost domestic support in Western societies, but you alienate a lot of international players who you would need. So why would even a more liberal Chinese decision maker, why would he sign up to your Ukraine coalition if you link it with Taiwan? Like, why would they do that, right? Why would actors in the global south, who are very suspicious of Western motives and have a legacy of Western imperialism, colonialism in their countries, why would they buy into this rhetoric, right? So, and that has led us to this very strange situation that the West has maneuvered itself, I think, into a corner where the current situation is actually cynically, and I don't say that because it's good, cynically more attractive than the other options, right? Because you can at this point either say, okay, we reach out to the Russians and we endorse negotiations, but then you let him sort of get away, Putin, with land grab, which would, go into this first dilemma, right? You can say we do incremental support, so you give more and more weapons to Ukraine, but then you run into this issue, okay, where is this famous Russian red line? And we can discuss this separately. So all like not really good options. Or you can say, okay, we'll just let it go on for a while. I mean, you wouldn't openly admit it like this. And now you have the strange situation that the parties who are able, that's my last comment on this, to adjust to a situation without negotiation at this point in the most comfortable way are ironically both the West and Russia. So why is that? Most Western societies, let's just be very honest and happy to hear some disagreements. I mean, those of us who are friends in Ukraine maybe feel differently, but most people on the streets of Western cities, I think they have adjusted to the war somewhat. Okay. In Russia, the coercion strategy has even had some reverse effects, right? The economy is surprisingly robust. You even saw a backflow of Russian capital. So they always had the problem of, getting that under control. Now you see them stabilizing that. You even see salaries of like military families and workers in the defense industry go up. It's almost like a domestic stimulus. Now in the long run, there will probably be inflation and budget deficits, but for now, they also can sit it out. So who cannot sit it out and for whom is it very bad? For the Ukrainians. Right? So that is like the terrible dilemma at the situation. And so that's just what I would say from an analytical perspective. And another question would be, okay, what could be done in order to do any negotiation at this point? But that would be a separate question.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Madam Ambassador, I said half jokingly that this idea that all the alternatives to the status quo are worse than the status quo sounds like the Middle East. And my question to you is, of course, given the fact that Finland is at the forefront, of course, of Russia, because you have a common border and now a member of NATO, who's everything that it implies in terms of Article 5. Is there an my question to you is there an understanding in when it comes to the Middle East and the perception of the Middle East of the connection between this very strong connection between Russia and Iran? Has the war, in other words, has the war in Ukraine and the Russian aggression and the geopolitical ties that Putin is building, has it had any impact on the way the conflict is perceived in the Middle East? Of course, in the wake of the war with Hamas, has there been any perception change regarding this conflict in the Middle East?
Thank you. Let me first say that, and to Arvid and to the previous comments, that in the end, it's not for all of us. It's really for Ukraine and the Ukrainians to sort of set the tone and say what is the right moment for them in terms of negotiating. We need to be talking about peace, but we also need to be supporting very much Ukraine in their efforts in order for them to be able to have a just peace, sustainable and just peace. Here, when it comes perhaps to the Middle East, yes, indeed, we are seeing some shifts. One of the main ones is that the global South is so much stronger than it used to be. It has agency, it has a will to participate, rightfully so, and participate in the conversation. So we have at the moment, I think, some kind of very complex war of narratives, battle of narratives about how the world looks and how problems are to be solved. And here, when it comes to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we are indeed seeing a conversation which is very much going in the direction of saying that Russian conduct is colonialist type conduct. And we see that in the global South. We see it elsewhere, and it also reflects somehow to the Middle East. But altogether, I mean, everyone who sits in this room understands also that these are very different conflicts as well. Ukraine is defending itself against another state, another state's aggression, a member of the permanent member of the UN Security Council, and of course here, in the case of your country, Israel, the self-defense is in relation to a terrorist organization. So very different, but there are certainly similarities, and from a European perspective, the thing that we will always say is that, be it that there are differences, be it that there are similarities, the same international law applies.
Yeah, I mean,
because in the end, we also don't want to see, an end result of the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, meaning that borders, international borders, can be changed.
Right.
We need to uphold sovereignty, territorial integrity, international law. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and of course, as we know, with the recent agreement between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, they were talking a lot about the common fight against imperialism, and as we know, Russia has absolutely nothing to do with imperialism and never had. It's like the cynicism, of course, of today's, discourse about this war. So thank you for that. I would like to go back to you, Antonia. Regarding this energy issue, if I may, first of all, do you have any intake and update about this famous pipeline that was talked about a few years ago, between us and Italy? Is it completely off the map, or is it still talk about it? Because originally, when in 2010, when Israel discovered this huge natural gas resources, offshore natural gas resources, there was talk about building a pipeline. So originally it was planned via Turkey because it made more sense, but the relation with Turkey deteriorated to a point that it's no longer in the cards. So first of all, do you think it's still realistic, or it's never going to happen? And B, how do you see the fact that Turkey today, and Erdogan is really having this more and more radical foreign policy, openly, I mean, even though they're a member of NATO, but openly challenging the West, aligning its positions with the Iranians and with Hamas. Do you see having an impact, or do you think that Erdogan is going to keep getting away with everything as he did in the past?
Thank you for both questions. Well, let me start with the first part. Well, this Mediterranean gas pipeline project, it is still a European project of common interest. And since the war on Ukraine is still going on, it is a project that is attracting discussions despite the technical challenges that this project faces. The financial is the last element, because the pipeline would have to cross, technically speaking, through deep and ultra deep waters in most of the area involved. So it is much, the companies which are involved as well, they have to ensure that for the construction of that piece of infrastructure, which entails all these technical challenges, financial challenges, they have to ensure that they have enough contracts in place in order to, make things commercially viable. This is not where we stand as of today. However, the project continues to be a European project of common interest. And just to say one thing, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine, because I just want to echo what I've heard previously, and then I'll connect that to Turkey, is that the war on Ukraine has strengthened the debate on Europe's strategic autonomy. In other words, how can Europe strengthen its ability to spend more on its defense? This debate has gained traction within European institutions. The proposal, for example, of Greek Prime Minister for the issuance of Eurobonds exclusively for the defense of Europe is at the core of those discussions, because such a Eurobond would enable European countries to strengthen their defense industry, the European defense industry, so that Europe would not always be forced to make major purchases outside of the European Union. So this is something that I would like to echo what has been said, and really it makes a lot of sense that Europe can become strategically autonomous, especially when Trump, during his presidential campaign, repeated that if he's reelected, he's going to seize American support swiftly. That has triggered NATO countries to look for additional plans for taking over from United States in coordinating military aid to Ukraine. And this has been a way to Trump-proof the Ukraine defense contact group. Now, when it comes to Turkey and the war on Ukraine, again, I would say one thing, which is very important when it comes to NATO and the European countries. So Turkey took the decision to close the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits to military traffic. But there's been an alternative, and a European country, again, the country I'm coming from, Greece, played a very instrumental role through the port of Alexandroupolis, which has literally turned into a staging ground for the transit of NATO and American military equipment to enter Europe and reach Ukraine. So this is something that has to be noted, and the ongoing transformation of the port of Alexandroupolis and the wider area does not only allow the movement of NATO military equipment and staff, but it also cements an emerging access towards Bulgaria. Why? Because Bulgaria has been increasingly valuable in NATO strategic thinking as an alternative to the Bosporus Straits, given the Black Sea's importance. Again, when it comes to Turkey, Turkey pursues a multifaceted foreign policy, but Europe, as an institutional organization of like-minded countries who are united in supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia, so that Russia is pushed back from its from Ukraine's internationally recognized territories, countries stand solidly behind Ukraine. It has developed alternative, viable options in order to fill that weapon, in order to take away that weapon that Turkey thought that would utilize against our Western countries, democracy, rules, and well, as Madame Ambassador said, we have to abide by international law. We have to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries like Ukraine. And our values, our shared values, are a strong motive for unleashing our common capabilities, and to ensure countries like Turkey that have this sort of multifaceted diplomacy, foreign policy, that they cannot weaponize that sort of policy against our values, our the very core principles of our shared values.
Yeah, thank you. Including Turkey's occupation of an EU member since 1974, or north of it, and large parts, of course, of northern Syria as well, and they get away with this as well. Thank you very much. Shashank, I'd like to ask you, in light of the upcoming election in the UK, and the military strategy in Europe vis-a-vis Russia. So as we know, historically, the French and the Germans have had this very complicated relation when it comes to defense and security in Europe. In 1954, France tried to initiate a common defense initiative with West Germany, which at the end was rejected by the French parliament. And after the Iraq War of 2003, at the time, Gerhard Schröder and Jacques Chirac were talking about a common European defense, kind of disconnected from NATO or within NATO, but of course the British at the time opposed this. So, of course, the British are, as Churchill said to de Gaulle in one of their arguments in 1944, said between Europe and the high seas, we shall always choose the high seas. And as the French chief of staff said to Churchill as the French army was collapsing in 1940, they said, well, at least you have a very efficient anti-tank obstacle, which of course is the Channel. But this being said, today, when President Macron speaks about European strategic autonomy, which translated in English means buying French military technology with German money, how does the UK and the upcoming Labour government sees itself in this complicated relationship between the French and the British when it comes to defense? Are the British going to be a partner in some kind of a military structure or common defense strategy, or are they just going to choose the high seas, as Churchill said to de Gaulle in June 1944?
Well, the short answer is nobody knows yet. But first of all, just to take a short step back, in the last few years, the UK-EU relationship has improved since its low ebb post-Brexit. And to give you an example of that in the military domain, the EU has a project called Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO projects, a series of some ambitious, some quite modest projects around defense and security. And one of them is about military mobility. It's about the capacity for European countries to move tanks and other units across their borders without being subject to red tape in a moment of crisis. That project was joined by, I think, an outside state, by the United States, and prior to its opt-out from foreign policy, which has now changed, Denmark as well. I think also Norway, which of course is not a member of the EU, but is a member of the single market. The UK then eventually, after much sort of hand-wringing, joined that project, which I think may seem completely bureaucratically insignificant to anyone here, but in the grand scheme, in the context of where we had been, was a step forward. Now, looking ahead, the problem, of course, is that a lot of what the French are talking about, and with some justification around the importance of integrating supply chains, is defense industrial autonomy. That is the idea, and you see this, for example, in a project relevant to Israel, the Sky Shield initiative in Europe, which is a project to involving German missile defenses, but also US and Israeli air defenses. France has concerns about this, and the uncharitable view is that French objections are around industrial protectionism. But in, speaking here not just parochially, but giving the French their due, they would also say, in a moment of crisis, we as Europeans, as a sovereign bloc, also have to be able to rely on our own supply chains politically, not on outsiders, because who knows in a future crisis if American military companies or indeed other foreign ones will be there when we need them. And that's why this is what sovereignty means, the capacity for self-defense. And you see that playing out right now on that front. On the British side, it is clear we will never be able to be full members of that defence industrial bloc. It's impossible. We're not members of the EU. That's a path we've chosen, and I won't litigate that here. But there are consequences of that, and one of them is that we will not be able to enjoy the same benefits in that sense, or be subject to the same obligations. And what we are seeing now is a UK take a very conscious choice, which is the high seas specifically. And to point to two big, ambitious UK projects, one of them is AUKUS, which is, of course, building a nuclear-powered submarine in concert with Australia, with help from the United States. Hugely expensive, hugely risky, unbelievably ambitious project that many people feel may not come to fruition. And on the other hand, our future warplane, the sixth-generation warplane, the Tempest fighter jet, will also be built with Japan, which is a huge step for us and part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, and with Italy, which is very important because it shows there's a major European defense power who is willing and able to collaborate with us still, even outside of the European Union. Having said all of this, the next Labour government wants closer political and security ties to the EU. There are some things, there are red lines they won't be able to cross, but there are some interesting conversations around, for example, attending the various committees that deal with foreign affairs as in a visiting capacity, and other forms of tailored cooperation, a security treaty that may cover certain things, but it will always be with one foot out of the camp. And we are going to be tested now, because if the political setup changes in Washington, it will put severe stress and pressure on our strategy in that regard.
Thank you very much indeed. One last question to Arvid, and then we'll try to take questions from the audience. But I'd like to continue on your previous analysis, which really I thought was very interesting, and ask you in terms again of strategy and negotiation. Obviously, I assume that everybody has on top of their mind in Europe, and so does Putin, the question of the next step in case we go into a long-term protracted conflict in Ukraine. We're more or less, as you said, most Europeans have gotten used to it. And of course, he has his eyes on the next stage, which I would think, for as far as he's concerned, as the Baltic states, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, as we know. How would you integrate this calculation, both in terms of Putin and NATO, of this very complicated strategic negotiating relationship? How do you integrate his vision and the Europeans' vision of the Baltics in this strategy?
That's a good question, and so I think it should start with on the Western side, if we take the collective West as an actor, with a sober assessment of the situation that it currently stands, and ideally an assessment of what the real Russian goals and objectives in the situation are. And I don't think that all players on the West are in consensus here. I think you have different interpretations of what Putin really wants of the Russians. You have different takes on where these red lines are, and you have also very different goals in European capitals. And it's very obvious what the different camps are. So that usually is a weakness in negotiations, right? So the first point would have to be, there would have to be more strategic clarity on what the goal here is, right? Again, is it we want to end this war as soon as possible? Is it we will actually be okay with some sort of frozen conflict as long as the illegal invasion isn't recognized? So there has to be some clarity about what is it that we really try to accomplish through negotiations. And in that context, reacting to what you said, Nina, so I think there is a difference between the statement the Ukrainians decide when to negotiate, right? There is a difference between using this in terms of political goals, right? So meaning, and that makes a lot of sense. It's also in line with European values, right? Not to say that there should not be prescriptively a dirty deal between great powers and there's slice and dice up Ukraine. But that's different than analytically saying the West, of course, has a lot of leverage in potential negotiations. And that's a reality, and everyone knows it. And I find it, given that the toll of the war is so much on the Ukrainians, I find it sometimes regrettable that some European leaders, and you didn't say it like this, right? But maybe some of your colleagues, they almost have this attitude, well, that's up to the Ukrainians to decide completely when to negotiate and what to do, as if we are all like innocent bystanders. But that's like, does anyone remember this phrase of the Afghan-led peace process? Okay, so that sounded also very good, right? And everyone was like, there should be no agreement in Afghanistan without buy-in from everyone. And then Trump came and made the Doha deal, right? So, and it is now conceivable that a similar like black swan event might happen in Ukraine. It's like extremely realistic, right? That another Republican president comes in, maybe Trump is back, and he might decide, okay, this war has to end now, but I will settle it on terms vastly more favorable to Russia than to Ukraine. And so I think in that situation, what could the West do at this point to circle around? I think the West has to figure out, in a world in which Western capitals cannot dictate outcomes anymore, in which cooperation is the important currency, what could be done to work more effectively with others who are currently not a member of the pro-Ukraine coalition? So why is it, and you made a very, I think, a brilliant point about this colonial issue, right? So the question is, if this is indeed a colonial conquest, why is it that so many countries in the global south don't sign up for the pro-Ukraine coalition? We should just think about that. Why don't they do it?
Well, one answer could be that there's no such a thing as a global south.
That could be one thing, but it could also be maybe that from a negotiation perspective, the West isn't leveraging openings enough that could make for more cooperation on specific issues where there are shared interests. I'll give you one example, then I conclude here. Maybe some of you saw the Chinese-Brazilian statement on the Ukraine war a couple of weeks back. And these two put explicitly in there that they are opposed to any use of weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine, especially nuclear use. Now, they didn't call anyone out, but everyone knows, we all know who they mean, okay? So this is probably as far as they can go in a statement without calling out Russia directly. So I think these are all openings where there are actually some shared interests between some players in the global south, and I would include those too, or like certainly Brazil, China, we can have a longer debate. But anyway, between those and Western capitals. So I think in order to strengthen the own negotiation perspective and ultimately also strengthening the Ukrainian position for negotiations, it would be very wise to think, okay, who can we recruit to this cause through more effective cooperation offers? And I think that has to be more pragmatic. It has to be grounded in mutual interests, such as no escalation of nuclear use. And at the end of the day, and this will be my last sentence, if there was a clear signal to the Russian government that crossing this line to nuclear use, if they understood that this will turn them into an international pariah, like the world has not seen before, right? If they understood this is something where India, China, United States, European Union, UK, they all see eye to eye. This is like a line that cannot be crossed. That sends a much stronger signal to the Russians than only the West saying that again and again, or the West doing another sanctions package. And the beautiful thing is you could even keep a lot of elements of the current pro-Ukraine strategy in place and just add this additional negotiation outreach campaign to other players in addition. Just that would, I think, already do a lot to ultimately help the Ukrainians and certainly improve the Western negotiation position.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it was a fascinating conversation. We still have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I'm sorry if we are a bit short of time, but we have, yes, Mr. Ambassador, we have, and we'll take also from the crowd. So 1, 2, and 3. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Estonian Ambassador. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. Fascinating debate, by the way.
Thank you.
So I have a comment about the goals. I understand that there is a little misunderstanding what are the goals are of Russia and what are the goals of Europe as such, or let's say collective West as you used the term. I don't like this term, but anyway. So it's very clear what Putin's goals are. He laid them out in a letter sent to NATO in February, or was it January, just 1 month before he had this full-scale war in Ukraine. And in this letter, they demanded that NATO turn itself back to the year 1997. So meaning destroying today's European security architecture and also destroying transatlantic relations, that is cornerstone of this architecture. Meaning more gray zones. Estonia, Baltic states will be there, Eastern European countries as well, Finland as well now. So more, not more stability, but more war. And what is the goal of, let's say, the counter goal, or what is the goal of the West here? You're right, there are different goals, but the main goal is very easy. It's restoring territorial integrity of Ukraine, because this territorial integrity is a cornerstone of United Nations Charter, and all the countries in the world are basically part of the United Nations, right? So the question, why should they not honor United Nations Charter? So you're right, that we have maybe problems of allying, let's say, this global south with our positions, but just don't quote me, I think they will go with the winner in the end. And we are going to be the winners. We don't have choice.
Thank you, Sarah Feinberg.
Just a few comments. Thank you for this fascinating debate. The first one, the name of the game that appears in all your presentations is that of interconnectedness. And you and us are involved and engaged deeply in two theaters of operation in which the Russian-Iranian rapprochement, which is turning today into a strategic alliance, is reverberating both strategically and operationally. And it does have consequences for the negotiations or for the strategic autonomy that you talked about. The second main point that appears, and I think it's so important to emphasize it very clearly, is the question of strategic autonomy. And not only at the procurement and R&D level, but at the conceptual level. Here in Israel, we are raising awareness, or we are understanding deeply the need for us to transition to strategic autonomous thinking. And I think that we have to learn from you, the Europeans, and the model that you laid out, which is a model of multilateral cooperation on specific projects, an ad hoc cooperation model, whether it's in air defense or drone production and others, such as the drone wall of the Finns and of Latvia. I think this is an amazing model for European countries and for Israel to continue promoting them. I have questions to you and to you. The first one, you talk about negotiations. Don't you think we are at risk of a certain mirror imaging by the fact that we are attributing to the Russian side the ways in which we in the West negotiate? In the Russian art of war, negotiation is a pure continuation of pressuring the adversary system, but they're not really negotiating, as you know better than me. They're not a reliable party. They don't take negotiations seriously. And for them, this is a way to continue the war on terms that are more comfortable for Russia in terms of resource spending. And it's a way also to mark an operational pause, but it's not negotiation per se. Second, we talked, Madam Ambassador, about the Ukrainian people. When I was in Ukraine last summer, I spoke with journalists, I spoke with military people, and all told me this is not a sell for the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people is still in this idea, like we in Israel, maybe a false idea that we're going to continue until we win. We are all shaped by this image of victory. How do you deal, Mr. Bell, with the collective awareness or the collective image of victory of the Ukrainian people? And the last thing to Mr. Joshi, don't you think that the time has come for us to learn from the Ukrainians? You talked about the gaps of European defense in terms of air defense, logistics, and C2. given the extensive operational experience of the Ukrainians, not only since February 22, but also since 2014, don't you think that we, as Western people and you as Europeans, can learn and place yourself as the students of the Ukrainian teachers in that field?
Thank you, Sarah. And one question from Julio Hassan, and then we'll go to our panel.
We spoke about the situation like I are today, about the possibility of using nuclear arms are very, very near, because we speak about Russia in Ukraine, but I speak about Iran in Israel. All the connection lately came a very strange warning from Lebanon, saying that they consider Cyprus a place that they can bombard. On the other side, Europe say, oh, at that point, we will intervene. I don't believe about Europe. The engagement of Europe are nothing, nothing special in Middle East. But this can be considered in some way an extension of Europe in our area.
Thank you, Julio. So I'll let our panel. Yeah, sorry, very briefly, and then we have to wrap it up.
Just a quick question. You were talking about European sovereignty and defense procurement or manufacturing. The EU has come up with their first defense industry strategy not long ago, and I was just wondering about your comments on it, because it seems to me that Germany does not longer want to be the payer for French industry. There's a lot of countries who understand the need to have their own industry, especially in Eastern Europe, but not only. And the rise of defense budgets in NATO. NATO's doing a lot of work on industry. The US comment of Europe has to go through wartime industry versus peacetime industry. And the gaps that you mentioned in air defense and other more costly concepts. And then the thing that other countries are, buying straight from the source. Sky Shield is a good example of the debate with France. And then obviously the concept of supply chains. Europe cannot be independent, not today. So I'm wondering, with all these different criteria and changes, do you really think that this concept of EU defense sovereignty in industry, which comes out in this new strategy, is it really feasible, or are we, every country's going to be to themselves, and Poland wants to buy from South Korea it will, and Turkey's going to sell their Bayraktars to whoever wants, regardless of industry rules and orders, and Finland's doing a really good job in procurement, and Estonia, and everybody's doing what it doesn't look like it's the EU. It could be NATO that's setting the standards, but I don't see the EU as a really central player.
Thank you. So we'll let each of our panelists to relate to the different questions, and please let's wrap it up quickly because we really have to leave the room. So please, very briefly. Thank you. We'll go in order.
Thanks all. Let me be as quick as I can. On learning from Ukraine, I agree. I wrote a long report last summer in The Economist, about 10 pages, on lessons from Ukraine. And I remember talking to the British training teams, training Ukrainian soldiers, Operation Interflex. And they said, we learn as much from them as we teach to them. And the example he gave was digging trenches, not something the British Army has been in a mindset to do in a serious way for many years. But as we see the renewed importance of cover and concealment in warfare as these things return to the fore, the mentality is coming back. But I also want to be realistic and say that the Ukrainians have some severe deficiencies. They have very limited coordination above the brigade level. Combined arms approach failed very badly last summer in the counteroffensive, and they still need extensive help from outsiders, for example, in helping to build some of the naval drones. There's a lot of indigenous development. We don't always see the foreign help that's going in, but that's there. So we need to sort of keep a balance there. On defense industrial strategy, I think you summed it up well. I mean, this is an aspiration, but the strategy itself recommended, I think, if I remember correctly, that 60% of procurement should come from within the EU. That simply is not possible. For a country like Finland buying F-35s, that would become impossible in the time frame they have, and no country is going to agree to that. So it's an aspiration, and I think more importantly, if you look at some national defense industries, I'm thinking of Sweden, Saab, their supply chains are profoundly reliant on the UK, the United States, and others. They would not be able to say we can simply buy energetics, explosives, rocket motors, all these other things from inside the EU, because those suppliers don't exist. So this is a long-term aspiration, and I think one thing to just bear in mind is that the point isn't necessarily to be autarkic in defense procurement, to be so sovereign in a North Korea sense. It's to friendshore as well. It's to know that if you need to procure key supplies of energetics for your shells, that much better that you're buying them from a Western partner than you are buying them from a partner who is completely geopolitically non-aligned. And I wonder if that's where the debate will head in the coming years as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arvid.
Okay, so this is a great point. I just don't believe that this clarity and this focus on this is primarily or only, or how you put it, right? You put it in a very concise way, about territorial integrity. I don't think that's really the strategic consensus that exists at the moment. If that really was the case, you could indeed do more outreach to the global south. You could even get you could get China and the Brazilians on board. I just don't think realistically that's currently the situation. And I think if you're saying it's mostly on Putin's side about the rollback of NATO, I think even they're very different assessments on even amongst the people in this room. So I think you have more conceptual clarity in that sense than maybe exists realistically on the side of Western governments. And without that clarity there, an effective negotiation strategy cannot really work. I thought about the point of negotiating with the Russians and mirror imaging. So there's one part I agree with and one point I disagree with. What I do agree with is that in Russian strategic thinking, there's a much bigger continuum, right? It's more like a continuum between war and peace, between coercion and engagement, than maybe in Western thinking. Okay. But the West negotiated with the Russians in the Iranian nuclear deal negotiations. And it worked until the Americans dropped out. So it's empirically not correct to say whenever you talk to any Russians, nothing will ever come out of it and will only be a tool of coercion. So the question is more, what negotiation strategies work, or how can you change the negotiation environment in a way that maybe some minimal consensus is possible? Right now, with Ukraine, we are not there yet, right?
But Iran is not Ukraine for the Russians.
No, I'm very well aware, and I'm not saying right now negotiations are realistic. But if you did more of this broader coalition building with China, with the global south, it would change the environment and also give other incentives to the Russians to negotiate in a different way. And so to conclude with this, of course, you are right, image of victory and the very heroic resistance of the Ukrainians has also inspired a lot of people, especially in Europe. And it is extremely difficult at this situation for the Ukrainians to even envision any kind of negotiations or concessions after war crimes, after everything that happened, after 2 years of resistance. So that is a very difficult problem. What I just want us to keep in mind, last sentence, is if there is no productive discussion of the role that negotiation could potentially play in the conflict resolution toolkit, if you don't even think about it in an analytic sense and try to at least reflect on some options, I think that's also depriving yourself from other options that you have on the table.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We must leave the room, and I'm teaching a class now, so I have to leave as well. But I would like to thank you all for this fascinating discussion, Madam Ambassador, Arvid, Antonia, and Shashank. It was really an excellent panel. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be in touch with you regarding Finland, because I'm really, we're serious about it. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. Just want to... Shashank?